And that's basically what we're going to do. I try to keep this quite interactive. So even between the bits and pieces that I'm going to introduce, I really want you to discuss via the chat box, via just by saying something and so on. And maybe somebody can read out the chat to me, because it's always a bit difficult if you do this on one screen to see all the different pods in Zoom. So this is based on the article that I think Katrin shared, which I did a few years ago, Language and Culture and How That Equals Effective Communication. And that's basically what we're going to talk about. Okay, so we're going to start with an image that I borrowed from my great colleague, Rob Gibson, who has been with Siemens for ages, retired a couple of years ago. And he used the idea of a cocktail. That he said, if you think about language, culture, and business, what you have is quite a complex interplay between language, culture, and the business situation. So we cannot teach language as such without actually considering for which situation do we teach it and what are the cultural factors, not only national culture. And this is something I would really like to point out right from the beginning. What, despite the fact that we have different attitudes when it comes to football, obviously. So what are the cultural aspects that are actually important? And I'd like to start with two stories that changed the way that I'm teaching fundamentally. And this is story one. Meet Klaus. Klaus took part in one of my courses, which was called English at Work. I did this for the Chamber of Commerce in Düsseldorf. And it was a 2 model course. So basically module 1 was B1. And then if people passed that module, they could do module 2, which was supposed to be B2 level. Klaus was A2 level in terms of command of English, vocabulary, grammar, and so on. However, he did the B1 course, so he was allowed to move on to the B2 course. And then he was, of course, there with people who had a significantly higher level, because quite a few of them were either B1 or B2. And he found that quite challenging, of course. But Klaus, in real life, negotiated a lot in English. He negotiated with Russians about building materials and prices. So when we did a simulation on negotiations, Klaus won the negotiation, full stop. I just looked at him, was like, I do not want to sit on the other side of the table negotiating with you, because his strategies that he was able to apply within his linguistic range were absolutely outstanding. And the others were like, so they, of course they supported, there was a lot of scaffolding we had to do in the course, but that was one of these aha moments where I went like, okay, so what is it actually that this person needs from me as a teacher in order to do his business in English successfully? The other story that I'd like to share with you is the story of Stefan. Stefan had to join one of the university courses I was teaching, which was English for engineers. So he did an engineering degree at the university, and all of them had to do a 2-semester English course. So he came into the classroom, looked at the handout, and basically said this: I did Shakespeare at school, I don't need this. And I was like, interesting. So to what extent can actually Hamlet help you to have an engineering discussion or present an engineering drawing or something like this? So, but he said, I've got a C1 level, that's in my certificate, I don't need this. Because what he failed to understand was, of course, that you need specific jargon, maybe specific skills, a specific register to be successful in your job. And that's not really what you learn at school. So we have this A2, successful negotiator in English, C1, no idea what he really needs in business. And this is actually what started me then thinking about what should we be teaching. Now, I've been in this business for roughly 25 years. And my experience when I look into materials, that is books, materials before ChatGPT and so on, is actually this. So the stuff that I deal with, even if it's a German publisher, shows that course books are still mostly written by British and American writers. So they are smarter these days. They use people who have been living abroad, who live abroad. So we have an international experience. But, and this is something that we're going to look at, these people still apply their own filters to politeness and to the use of language. So we are still getting certain conventions that are either British or US American in different ways, which is of course generalizing, because like Scottish conventions can be different from Southern English. And it might be human behavior, but it does lead to problems. There is now definitely a higher share between interaction between native and non-native speakers, but there is still less interaction among non-native speakers as such. And what we get is very often that native speakers are presented as experts, and they're often presented as experts in two ways. So they're interviewed as experts on specific matters like negotiations, but they're also experts on the language. So we have situations in textbooks where they're actually correcting the non-native speaker about pronunciation or other mistakes that they make. Now, we as teachers and readers apply our own filters too. So what exactly do we expect then from course books? And how do we deal with this? And how much adapting is necessary for my context when I have maybe a unit that I find quite useful, but I say, in my context, it doesn't work like this. So the people that my learners deal with speak or communicate in a totally different way. So when it comes to teaching, and this is why BELF is very important, because it's not the reality of my learners. Anglo-American content prevails. So also when it comes to writing conventions, when it comes to the concept of politeness, so we have small talk, we have the use of humor, compliments, and so on. And that's actually, that the language in the textbook is what we often take over subliminally, and we don't really think about that this is the language that we're teaching. And this is basically how I started, how I set out, and I think quite a few of you did the same. I'm going to show you two examples. This is from a very recent book. This is something that came out about 4 years ago. So, and there's a situation that a new Polish co-worker, who happens to be female, wants to build relationships. She's given the advice to focus on sharing personal experience and to bond through appreciation of others. And when she demonstrates her own specialist knowledge, this is dismissed by her largely British co-workers as bragging. So as something that's seen as threatening to colleagues. This, of course, establishes a certain British norm of how we build rapport. So the advice does not reflect cultural aspects, like, for example, power relationships. First of all, how you build relationships does depend on the role. So what position does your interlocutor have? Which strategy may work? In some cultures, and German culture is one of them, you must demonstrate knowledge to be taken seriously, especially as a woman. So this is actually something where definitely the situation in the course book, the textbook, already clashes with the demands that my learners would have. And I would have to think about how do we actually need to change language and communication. And here we come to actually a task for you, responding to a compliment. So first of all, there is the assumption that compliments are fine. That is already difficult to discuss. So we have this, you did a fantastic job on that project, and I just want you to tell me in the chat box, which of these would you see as an appropriate response? Number 1, number 2, or number 3?
Kirsten, most people are saying 1. We had 1, 3 here. 2 3s, 1 2, but
okay.
Mostly 1.
Okay, so question. What is behind each response? So number 1 is, of course, this kind of like giving back the compliment. I really appreciate your help too. Number 2 is something where obviously the person says, the praise is deserved. I achieved something. I know I did a great job. And number 3 is something where basically you try to play down the compliment. Maybe also because in your culture or in your business context, compliments aren't normal. No? So what we have is then different ways to do this. So number 1 would be perfectly okay in a more collectivist culture where the team effort must be praised. I use this actually for relationship building straight away. Number 2 would be in an okay if the company runs a more individualistic culture where personal acknowledgement really matters. And 3 is compliment denial culture. So, and that is exactly, there isn't a right or wrong. And how I respond depends very much on the business situation, who paid me the compliment and why, and also the kind of cultural factors. So is it actually okay to receive or acknowledge compliments and performance in that way? And can I just ask, in the business context where you're teaching, how do you respond to a compliment? So are there other options where you're saying, I would advise people do this or that? You can use your chat or you can unmute yourself.
Lucas mentioned humor, respond with humor or deflection.
Yeah.
Victoria mentioned compliments are rare in general. Ron mentioned danke. Thank you.
Yeah. So very often a simple thank you. And then moving on to the next topic. Yeah. Not really discussing this at all. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
We had another show appreciation to co-workers.
Yeah. So you see here where these are suggestions, and the textbook where this is taken from actually suggests number 1 because it says good for relationship building. But we can't just say this is the correct response to a compliment because this is just seen through certain filters. There's so many things that we have to actually take into consideration here. So, and that is actually what our learners' environment shows and what we have to reflect. So the first question is, of course, who do your learners talk to? Then what English and what communication conventions do they need to learn? In my case, I would say 20% of my learners talk to native speakers, or let's say 20% of their communication actually involves native speakers. The rest is done with non-native speakers, and you cannot learn all the communication conventions. It's impossible. So I have to think about what works in different contexts. So, and then of course, if we have this Anglo-American communication rules, does it help me when my German learners, for example, talk to Argentinian people or Kenyan people or Chinese people? So we have to think about that certain factors and complements don't work in, for example, a collectivist culture, and empowerment of people doesn't work in a culture where we have, as Hofstede calls it, high uncertainty avoidance. High uncertainty avoidance is the high need for rules and control. Yeah, you want to have safety, you want to have clear path and everything. And then individuals cannot just go and do things any way they want to, because then the manager isn't in control any longer. So when I started, one of the first big clients I was working for was actually a German company that was taken over by a British company. And in addition to that, there was a lot of outsourcing and offshoring going on because this British company was a multinational, was one of the biggest petrol and petrochemical companies in the world. And this is a good example when I think about what situations my learners were facing, and this is really where BELF comes in. So suddenly they were faced to do conference calls with Americans and Chinese. And if you have to do that in the same conference call, time is really a killer. They had to do small talk, for example, with Turkish clients. They got these long and cryptic emails that they didn't understand. Then they wrote very short and succinct emails, grammatically perfect, but they wondered why they didn't get any reply. And so the British bosses often sent them these kind of like slide decks, 50 PowerPoint slides, very densely written. And of course, my German learners were the only ones who did read these slides before the meeting and were the ones prepared in meetings, and wondered why the rest didn't read them. And I think that was really one thing that they found really strange. They were asked in meetings by the English in particular, how do you feel about it? And can you imagine why this is strange for Germans, to get a question, how do you feel about this, in a business meeting? So emotions have nothing to do with business, according to the Germans. And of course, they have very often very long meetings that never finished on time, and there were no decisions taken, so there was no result. And my learners were quite despairing because they always blamed their English. So if I don't understand the email, it's my problem. I said, no, actually, the writer can't write. So he doesn't use any punctuations. He writes the way he thinks of something like this. There's nothing wrong with your English. So we had to work on different strategies to enable them to handle these business situations better. And the other problem was also a low attention span in presentations. So that very often people after 10 minutes get quite bored and were not really prepared for 50 minutes of information. And as I said, there was a lot of outsourcing, or rather offshoring, involved. And in particular, certain parts of the accounting business, that is creditors and debtors, were offshored to India. So, and here we go. My learners were suddenly facing different situations. So they were dealing with people who had a work perfect English, but a very unfamiliar accent, or accents rather. Then they wrote things like Dear Müller or Dear Schmitz. So this very different use of names upset the German colleagues. Very often the Indians didn't reply to emails. And they came over for work shadowing, so they were told how to do these accounting things. And they always said yes. And the Germans understood, yes, I know what to do. What the Indians meant was, yes, I'm listening, I'm following. And they brought all this into the classroom. So we really left the English aside and started talking about communication, strategies, culture, and why people communicate in a certain way, because it's not, of course, something that you learn at school or that you can learn from a textbook. So, for example, we started with decoding. We started with paraphrasing because they asked, is that clear? They got the answer, yes. So, of course, tick, it's clear. I said, well, maybe you should ask, okay, can you tell me how you would do it to check if it's really clear, or if they just try to get out of this situation very quickly, move on to the next point. So the same with any questions. So they usually say no, but you can see from their faces that they have questions. So you need to reword this phrase. So what questions do you have? Or do we need to discuss this and that again in order to help people actually come forward with this? Because any questions is very often a question killer. I think you know this slide already, and this is where we are moving actually more into the BELF application in the classroom. I think the figures vary. So some people say it's 370 million, some people say at the moment it's 420 million native speakers, but it's definitely the 2000 million L2 and EFL speakers in the different circles. And this is, of course, where my learners do business with. So there is the UK and there is the US. There's very little business done with Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. There's a lot of business done with other European countries, with Latin America, and with huge parts of Asia. And they use English in very different ways. And this is also something that is reflecting the business world of today. And I'm sure that some of you have heard VUCA before. For those of you who don't, VUCA is a term that was coined after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, because where there used to be something like blocks, where you knew who was good and who was evil, something like this, the world suddenly started turning. So it became volatile, it became uncertain, it became even more complex, and it became very ambiguous. And this is also something that I think happened, especially in the 1990s, because business areas just opened up far more widely than before, with the use of English as a business language. So what we had were these different streams of flow. So we had this flow of languages and cultures, and people needed a common vehicle to communicate. So we had this flow of communication and information. And what we learned at university, and that was, I think, maybe one of the most important things, was English is a creative language. English isn't something that's set in stone. I think no language, unless it's very dead, like ancient Egyptian or Latin or something like this, is actually set in stone because it's shaped by the people who are using it. These are the drivers of language. It does involve the native speakers who very often want to stay in control of the language, but and this is actually where English is such a great example, because most people who speak English are not native speakers of English. These are the drivers of the language. They bring in their L1. They figure out how to communicate and how to circumscribe something where they're not quite sure what the correct term is and so on. So we have this constant moving, changing, and adapting of language to people's needs, but also of people to language, because they're taught to use language in a certain way and have to relearn if they see that this certain way that they've been taught in a business English course isn't successful. And this is why I brought in this idea of VUCA, because I think the VUCA world is very much a BELF world. BELF is one of the few securities because it gives me a strategy to apply when I need to communicate with people from different business backgrounds, different languages, and different cultures. I am not sure how familiar you are with the English Next project that David Greddle did in 2007 for the British Council. What he analyzed was actually the use of English in tourist interaction. And he found that most tourist interactions are done in English, and 74% of them are between different non-speakers of English, and only like English to other countries. So we have English speaking to Thailand or Germany or whatever, and that would be 12% in other countries. So people staying in the US or in Britain would actually be roughly about 10%. So you see, that's really the big one. And I'm at this point, I'd like to point out that as a follow-up project, the British Council did something that they called the Future of English, where they did some more research and made some more predictions. And this is also something we can't go into it today, but this is also a very important, interesting project, how they see English developing. So you can just Google British Council Future of English, and then you get their results and their predictions, and also some very interesting video discussions on this. So I know that you actually changed BELF. You moved to business. So for me, traditionally, BELF is business English as a lingua franca, but you moved it to English as a business lingua franca. I think that actually makes more sense. Because it's really the way I do this in business, and not a conventional Anglo-American set of or register of business English, which I think is quite interesting. But again, we have this, what I said in the beginning, we have these three aspects, which is language, communication, and culture. So when we think about interaction, I'd like to draw to this a bit more complex Venn diagram. So we have, for example, the Netherlands, and then we have China. So we have language 1A, which would be language 1B, which would be Mandarin, and language 2 would be something like English. But maybe they don't speak the same kind of business English. So in this BELF setting, they have to start communicating in a way that makes sense for them, and they have to create this communication together in this kind of extra space in the situation they're in. And that's very often not what they learn from the textbooks or in the course book. And when the native speakers come in, then we find quite often that they need adaptation too. So they need scaffolding, they need to adapt the way that they use English as well. And that's also quite important. So this interaction in the different languages and with the different registers then also depends on cultural aspects. So we have here culture 1, which would be national culture, like Dutch culture, but it could also be a company culture of KLM or something like this. Then we have culture 2, which is the one, again, they learned, which is this Anglo-American business culture. And we have culture C3, that would be, in our case, the Chinese culture. And instead of the BELF, we have here pluriculture. And pluriculture is the term that's quite recently been coined by the CEFR. And you go like, do we need another one? But pluriculture actually describes the ability to move between different cultures and to create with people from other cultures a common culture. So it's not just multicultural or intercultural. And this is actually what makes it quite special and what really helps to understand why this is so important in the BELF context of business. So here are two examples from the descriptors of the pluricultural mediation part, which is now in the CEFR. And you see this here. At a high C1 level, it would be, for example, that you are able to anticipate misunderstandings. And you help to maintain a positive interaction. You contribute to a shared communication culture by managing ambiguity and by offering advice and support. But even at a B1 level, because you know that things are different, you can act in a supportive manner in intercultural encounters, recognizing the feelings and different worldviews, or showing awareness that some questions may be perceived differently in the cultures concerned. Because we know that most of our misunderstandings in a BELF context are not misunderstandings that are linguistic. They can be sociolinguistic, but they're actually misunderstandings that come from a different cultural background or from different cultural expectations. So to outline this, the pluricultural focus actually distinguishes itself from intercultural and multicultural. So to be supportive, to focus on the situative competence, which is of course also very BELF, to assess and anticipate situations and to strive for this common communication culture. And that means if I'm able to act as a mediator, my level of English is less important. The thinking about how I use English in order to build relationships, to create this common communication culture, to do business successfully, this is then what matters. So we look at active things like moderating, mediating, anticipating, and developing solution strategies. And the CFR didn't just call it pluricultural, they also call it plurilingual, because by now we are very much aware of the role, the different languages that we speak, the role this has actually in our use of English. So this is something you can see here. To sum this up, I would say cultural aspects can never be separated from language and communication because it influences how things are interpreted, how we interpret things that are said, but also how others do this. And it's quite important that we don't just mediate between cultures, but to build this own common culture in which we actually speak BELF. So, and that in the plurilingual way would be that the speaker is also able to move between different languages. They are aware of these different L1s that we have, and that might also help to create this kind of successful BELF environment. So how do we achieve this? Well, we actually need more focus on interaction and situations. And we have to think about these three aspects of language: the purpose, what I use it for, how do I use it, and what is the functionality of what I'm going to say. And that's what I actually teach a lot. So I really listen to my students far more and say, okay, so if that's the situation you're facing, what functionalities, what functional language can help you? We have to build awareness. We often do that through reflection and observation. And then we think about the metalinguistic skills, and we have to redefine the descriptors in different contexts. And I fully agree with the point that Evan made at some point that very often publishers of business English course books just use the descriptors and say, oh, this is B1 plus and this is B2, and they don't really think about what goes into the books. But if you go to the base text, the source text, which is the CFR, and you look at the descriptors in different contexts, and they are, and I'm going to show you some examples, then they can really make sense in the BELF context that I actually think they are very much BELF-like. So for example, what is new in the CFR was this idea of mediation, where the pluricultural and the plurilingual can be found too. So reflecting that we bring in our own L1, that we have this kind of awareness of the L1 of our business partners, and there can be native and non-native speakers, that we need to adapt language. For example, don't use too much specialist jargon if you give a presentation to non-specialists, that we have these activities of mediation, so mediating a text, mediating a concept, and so on. And these strategies of mediation, like explaining concepts, simplifying text, and so on, which is actually quite important. And one example would be here leading group work, which is something that's very often essential in the business English context. And you can see here that these are really functions, can intervene supportively in order to focus people's attention on aspects. It doesn't say exactly what you need to say in the situation, but if it works for you and your group, that you say, if I say this, then everybody understands what I mean, and then we can all work better together, then this is exactly supportive intervention. Can explain ground rules, which is also something that's very important. Can formulate questions and feedback to encourage people to expand on their thinking. So see, these are communication strategies, these are management strategies, and it's not really about the linguistic side, but that you and your learners need to work out how can they actually do that. And the question would be, would you say these are three, or so you see here some more, of course, I just highlighted three. Are these situations, are these functions that you teach in your classroom? Or is your context completely different? You say, my learners never have to do group work, and if they lead group work, we don't do it like this. Put your ideas in the chat, or simply, oops, sorry. So, or actually unmute yourself. So.
Hi, can I share real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, these are really great things to discuss in meetings. So, for example, what I like doing with a group of students is to try to analyze. Okay, when you're in a video call, with this team. Okay, for example, as a leader of this call, as a team lead, what exactly do you actually have to do? Like, what does this managing a discussion in a meeting mean? And so we try to come up, and I help them to come up with these kind of things. Okay, I have to invite people to ask questions, or I have to interrupt, or I have to. And so I always first try to raise awareness of these so-called functions, small functions within a meeting. And then from there, it's really nice to then brainstorm the language. Okay. Or, by the way, other aspects, not maybe linguistic, but techniques. Okay, how do I interrupt a very talkative, I don't know, American colleague? I feel shy. And so there are besides around language, there are these interesting strategies which are maybe cultural. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And of course, the functions that you describe, I can do at any level. But if you go to a typical glossary of phrases, they say, okay, so these are different functions like welcoming participants, and they give these 20 phrases. 15 of them, none of my learners have ever heard in a meeting. I would only use 5 of them. And then we have to think about, okay, so what would you say? What can you say? What impact does it have? And so on. And of course, also considering what would be understood. So the problem that we have quite often, and I think video calls are a great example, is everybody just assumes that other people know what you mean. And it's quite often not the case. So rules are not set out in the beginning, and people have no idea what the communication culture should be like. If the lead, for example, doesn't say so in the beginning or something like this. So I think we need a lot of more clarification around those sociolinguistic and functional language. What actually makes a good meeting? What makes a good video conference call for people in a specific context? Thank you.
Yeah, so can I add to that too?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah, so I just put in the group chat, I said, yes, in my context, we have to sort through the hierarchical structures before we can get to managing groups and meetings. And I actually discussed that quite a lot with my learners, because if they work in a state-owned enterprise and there's very powerful hierarchies versus if they're in a private enterprise and they're flatter structures, and we really have to get to the base the base of that before we can move on to the actual managing of groups and meetings, because they need to have an understanding of those relationships, and it affects it quite a lot.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and again, I think this is also changing in textbooks, but still, I think textbooks tend to start like they start from the wrong end in a way. So instead of saying, okay, so if you have this meeting, what do you not like about it? What needs to change? What would make it successful? And then start building a language set that they can use in different contexts and can adapt to different contexts. They often start with this kind of generic language and say, so this is what you say, and this is this function, and only to find out that, and this is what my learners tell me, that in their context, it very often doesn't work. So yeah, so Michael also says something about that. Yes, so they tend to focus on formulate common response type. Yeah. So, and that's, Michael, what you say, that's because they're so insecure of using English that they really cling to this, like this must be the correct phrase. And the question, because this is what my learners tend to do as well. Yeah, so I learned this must be right, this must work. And then they're quite shocked when they realize it does not have the effect that they wanted to. Michael, is that your experience too?
Yes, sorry, I was just typing, but for my learners, that they imagine that in any interaction there's a correct response. There's a single correct response, and when others are not using that expected response, that they tend to feel overwhelmed, or they tend to feel underprepared. So so my learners often ask me, you know, for a list of vocabulary that can prepare them for, you know, a negotiation or for some sort of meeting, and that doesn't always work, because the other people don't use that same playbook, right?
Yeah. I have pretty much the same experience. So that when I teach groups of Germans, then of course they do the simulation. They all understand each other because it's based on the same assumptions. They've been raised with same sets of English. But when they go out into the international business world, then very often they say, my preparation was rubbish because it didn't have the effect that I wanted to. And so I start now telling them, prepare less and listen more. Really try to find out what matters, learn to ask questions, to paraphrase, build some common ground in something like this, instead of having this wonderfully prepared negotiation language and use it to demonstrate how great your linguistic skills are in English, and then you fail completely because you have no idea what the other side wants. And I'd also like to go back to something that Kurt said in the chat. He said, I find it interesting and relevant to raise awareness of the roots of all this in everyday communicative competence. Yes. And I think since I started really teaching business communication rather than business English, believe me, I've become a much better communicator. I've also become a more manipulative communicator because I really think about how can I achieve with certain members of my family or certain colleagues or something, how can I achieve things in a certain way using a certain communication? But this is also something that is at the heart of most of my intercultural training, because that also involves a lot of communicating with different people. So I think there's one more comment in the chat on this before we actually move on. Yeah, exactly. On focus on the connection building, relationship building. And it comes to common ground and being flexible. Absolutely. Yes, I think that's also very important. Good. Then I close the chat and we're just going to move on. So because we come to the last part of this, and then I'd like to open the discussion, and I think I leave it to the organizers. I leave it to Virginia and Hannah if they want to move you into breakout rooms or not. So why do we need then BELF in the classroom? And I should say, for me, BELF is not a nice to have. It is not an add-on. Like intercultural competence, BELF is the only thing that helps if people need to do business internationally. And then now we have to still convince a lot of people who cling to these formulaic sets of language that are learned in textbooks, but I think it's the only way forward. And here are some arguments that you can actually use. So first of all, we have a higher number of multilingual, but also of plurilingual speakers. We have these global settings of business scenarios where 75% just are not native speakers of English and use English any way they want to. I think BELF really allows to include these intercultural or pluricultural aspects, especially as we need to be aware of limitations. As I said, you cannot know everything about all cultures or behaviors, so you have to build this kind of common ground through BELF and pluriculture. We have to really focus on reflection observation. Most scenarios in textbooks do not really get critical reworking, where basically they tell you, well, this could be an option, but it could also work like this. And this kind of perfect business English world that's often created in courses and textbooks gives you a false security. And that false security, if our learners take that out into the business world, into real life, is actually where they fail. And then they quite rightly complain because they feel that our courses do not prepare them for the real business world. So, and this is, I think, why we really need BELF in the classroom. And I'm just going to briefly, before I wrap up, give you a couple of examples, actually 2 or 3 examples. So this is the first one. So in this case, the client I was working with was taken over by an American company. And what we did basically, to get the permission to do that, was they recorded an entire meeting. And then we took that meeting and listened to it and really analyzed the different communication styles. And based on that, we really thought about, okay, so what can foster, what can improve the communication here? This is something embedded in his book for Collins, for listening, if you still get hold of it, because it's a bit outdated. The material is fantastic because this is BELF. This is BELF Live. This is not scripted. These are real business conversations that he uses. And I think this is something that's a lot better than anything that you and I can write or ChatGPT can write or you find on the internet. So what we then did was we really focused on the strategies to establish understanding, checking, rewording, adapting, and everything, but also establishing a set of practical rules, similarly to what we had before with leading group discussions, to enable better meetings in the future. Example 2 was negotiations with a client. So there was an international cast of speakers, and there were different scenarios. So where we went like, so what if the boss tries to please the client? What if the boss sides with the employee? So what different behaviors, what would happen if the employee stuck to the facts instead of creating white lies that would please the client? What would happen if the employee started presenting an innovative solution? And so we, together in the classroom, they worked through different contexts so that they were actually able to respond if something like that happened. And this also encourages critical thinking, because you say, so you have all these options, which one for you would be the best way forward? How would that work out in a role play? And that is also something that, of course, encourages critical thinking. So there isn't just one solution. And this was actually something we did then with a situation, a textbook. So they watched a negotiation, and then we started like, what would you do differently? Maybe the publishers of the textbooks were not so pleased, but they never knew about that. So this is then another activity. This is actually adapted from an article that came out about 12 years ago in the Daily Telegraph. And this is something which reflects on high and low context. So basically hiding the meaning. For example, when a high context speaker says that's not bad, a low context speaker, somebody like me who takes things very directly, would understand that's good, but he actually means it's rubbish. Or something like that. So, and you have this when, for example, an English person says, very interesting, they mean maybe that's clearly nonsense, but I would understand, oh, they're impressed, they like my idea. And what I do is I cut this up, and then people have to put the different pieces together to really see that it's not about the language, it's about the usage. It's about maybe hidden meanings or something like this. This is a pretty complex one. If you want the worksheet, I'm happy to share that with you, but I have to be back at home because it's somewhere hidden on my computer. And this is another example, which is 10 ways of saying no without saying no. So again, people get these 10 statements without the the numbers, and then they have to put them from very soft, very mild ways of saying no to very strict ways of saying no. So can I ask you just to read them and to tell me which of these would you never say? Just put in the numbers. Which of these would you never say? We go like, no, that's not the way I talk.
So we have here 6, 5, 10,
that would be a
6,
problem. Yeah.
9, 5, 7,
We have a lot of low context
3,
speakers here,
1,
but some,
9. Yeah, 3.
And high context speakers. Yeah.
Yes.
And is there something you would find really difficult to understand as a no? Because my German learners, if you tell them it may be difficult for us to accept it, they go, well, okay, may be difficult, but we'll find a way. They wouldn't see this as a no. Is there something that you would really find difficult to understand?
Two,
Mm-hmm.
4.
Okay.
2.
Now, so again, these very soft ones, which will still leave room for maneuver. Yeah. So, and that's basically what we start with, and then they actually in the meeting simulations they have to use phrases like this on purpose. So they get play cards and they have to say no very clearly or very softly, and then we really discuss how did you feel doing this. But it helps them to widen their range of using language. So if somebody who's a low context speaker and likes phrases like that isn't really an option, they can say, I find that difficult to agree to if they have to. It's just they wouldn't think that maybe this might be, with some people, a more effective strategy. Yeah, or the other way around. So what do we need to do? When you have materials where you think, this is really a critical dialogue, this is too monodimensional, this does not really allow for the range of flexibility that my learners need, then it would be really a good idea to voice them. So basically the typical textbooks that I mentioned in the beginning. So set high order thinking task for your students, challenge the perception, what's going on in the dialogue, and use them maybe even as a bad example. I say this is maybe not the best way to do business. So the audio and the video. When you teach, of course, that's, I think, basically the idea of the whole talk here. We have to teach more than just the language. So we really have to think about, if I communicate, what is the impact? How do I build awareness in the classroom of those things? And this also means that we have to design class content accordingly, so that we provide focus on how appropriate is the way of communication that I usually apply. What should I change? Where should I adapt? Not because something is wrong with the way I communicate, but because I want to be more successful in the communication. I want to have a wider range so that I can be more convincing, get the results that are good for me and for my partner as well. So this is also something that we have to teach. As I showed, what I usually do is, and I heard that also from you, we build on the situations and the encounters of your learners. I have by now an archive on everything. So managers come into my classroom and say, oh, this negotiation went wrong, and then we really pick it apart and try to build a better one. And this is something that's also very important, and it took me roughly about 10 years to get there. Check your own biases and assumptions as a teacher trainer. Because you think that the way you communicate is clear, your students think totally different. Anybody who's been in the classroom with me knows when I give instructions, I think they're crystal clear. My students look at me and go like, what exactly do you want us to do? So this is also something that we really have to do. Think about our functionality, how can we express things more clearly, because that helps our students, our learners, to understand, okay, our teacher also needs to do adaptation and scaffolding depending on the teaching context. And most importantly, make your learners see that there is no one solution for all, that they really have to use language in a more creative way. And it doesn't really matter if it's grammar perfect, as long as it's appropriate to the context. So that's basically it. And this is the kind of conclusions with which I would like to open the discussion. So all our English voices are important. So we also have to build on this kind of confidence. Our learners need to create what I call a persona or identity in English that allows for comfortable performance. So they need actually a wider range. I actually think we have to stop dividing people along native and non-native speaker lines. They are either effective communicators or they're not effective communicators and want to be so. So want to be effective communicators, hopefully. And we need to start talking about the skills of plurilingual communication and, of course, build this wider awareness of the challenges of pluricultural communication. I think BELF is a great way to do that. So that's it from me. It was a bit longer than half an hour, but we had already discussions in between, so I hope it wasn't too boring.